Did you enjoy the surprise I planned for you, Mom? Daniel asked with a proud smile, and for a brief second, Margaret Collins felt something tighten in her chest, not from joy, but from a quiet, unsettling confusion because she had no idea what surprise he was talking about, and yet everyone around her was already acting as if she should have known. The dining room of the suburban house in Westchester County was filled with warm light, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, and the long oak table was decorated with white lilies, Daniel's favorite choice for what he called elegant simplicity, though Margaret had always found them a little too cold, a little too formal for something meant to feel like family. 68. Margaret moved slowly but deliberately, her posture still straight despite the years, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and she wore the navy blue dress she had bought nearly 5 years ago for her husband's retirement party, a dress she had not worn since the day he passed, a dress that now felt both familiar and distant, like a memory she could not fully step back into. Daniel stood at the head of the table, confident, polished, every inch the successful man he had become, his tailored blazer fitting perfectly as he gestured toward the kitchen where Victoria was arranging something out of sight, her movements precise, controlled, her smile present but never quite reaching her eyes. "Mom, I told you about it weeks ago," Daniel continued, his tone light, almost teasing, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it, something Margaret could not quite name, something that made her fingers tighten slightly around the back of the chair in front of her. Margaret offered a small, polite smile, the kind she had learned to use over the years when something didn't quite make sense but she didn't want to make a scene, and she nodded as if she understood, even though her mind was quietly retracing every conversation they had shared over the past month, searching for any mention of a surprise, any detail she might have missed, but finding nothing. The house itself was unfamiliar, not in structure, but in feeling, because although it belonged to Daniel and Victoria, and although she had been invited here countless times, tonight there was a distance in the air, a subtle shift that made everything feel staged, as if she were stepping into a moment that had already been rehearsed without her. Victoria finally stepped into the room, carrying a small velvet box, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, and for a moment, her gaze met Margaret's, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something sharp and fleeting, before she turned back to Daniel with that same polished smile. "Go ahead," Victoria said gently, her voice smooth, encouraging, but Margaret noticed how tightly she held the box, how her fingers pressed into the fabric as if she were bracing herself for something. Daniel took the box with an eager nod, turning back to his mother with a look that was meant to be warm, meant to be generous, but Margaret could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes avoided hers for just a fraction of a second before settling into place. "Open it," he said. Margaret hesitated, only briefly, before reaching out, her hand steady despite the quiet unease growing inside her, and as she lifted the lid, she expected to see something symbolic, something sentimental, but instead, what she found inside made her pause in a way she could not disguise, because nestled in the velvet lining was a set of keys and a folded document, official-looking, damp, and completely unfamiliar. "It's your lake house," Daniel said, his voice bright with expectation. "The one I transferred to your name 2 years ago." The room seemed to still around her, the soft hum of conversation fading into something distant, and Margaret looked down at the keys again, then at the document, then back at her son, her expression calm but her mind suddenly racing, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had never seen these keys before, had never signed any document like this, had never received any lake house, not 2 years ago, not ever. "That's very thoughtful," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, her voice even, controlled. But inside, something had shifted. Something cold and precise beginning to take shape as she realized that whatever this surprise was supposed to be, it was not a gift, not really, but something else entirely, something that had been hidden from her, something that, for reasons she did not yet understand, Daniel had believed she would never question. Margaret did not react immediately, not in the way Daniel expected, not with surprise or gratitude, but with a quiet stillness that settled over her like a second skin as she closed the velvet box gently and placed it back on the table with care, as if the weight of it required more respect than she was willing to give. And for a moment no one spoke. Not Daniel, not Victoria, and not the distant hum of the refrigerator that seemed suddenly louder in the silence. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting her son's face with a calm that had taken decades to perfect, the kind of calm that came from years of managing disappointment without letting it show, and she offered a small nod that felt appropriate, measured, and safe. "It is very generous," she said again, her voice even, almost soft, but inside her thoughts were moving with precision, replaying his words. 2 years ago, transferred to your name, as if they belonged to a different story, one she had never been told. Daniel exhaled slightly, relieved, his shoulders loosening as if he had been holding something back, and he smiled, reaching for his glass of wine, already moving past the moment as though everything had gone exactly as planned, while Victoria stepped back toward the kitchen, her posture composed but her movements just a fraction too quick, her heels tapping out a rhythm that Margaret noticed without looking directly at her. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, her fingers tracing the faint grain of the wood, and she let the conversation resume around her. Daniel talking about property values, about weekend getaways, about how peaceful the lake was in the early morning, details that should have felt familiar if they were truly hers, but instead sounded distant, rehearsed, like lines from a script she had never read. She nodded at the right moments, allowed a small smile when it was expected, and kept her voice steady when she responded, but her mind had already begun to separate itself from the room, stepping back, observing, noticing the way Daniel avoided specifics when she asked simple questions, the way Victoria did not return to the table, the way certain words were chosen carefully, as if each sentence had been shaped in advance. When dinner ended, Margaret stood slowly, thanking them both with the same quiet grace she had always carried, and she declined Daniel's offer to stay longer, explaining that she preferred to get home before it grew too late. Even though the drive was less than 30 minutes and the roads were familiar, Daniel insisted on walking her to the door, his hand hovering near her elbow but never quite touching, his smile still in place, still confident, and Margaret allowed it, stepping out into the cool evening air where the silence felt cleaner, more honest. And as she made her way to her car, she paused for just a second, her hand resting on the roof, her reflection faint in the dark glass, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper now, more focused. She drove home without turning on the radio, the steady hum of the engine filling the space instead, and each mile gave her room to think, to place each detail where it belonged, to examine the edges of what she had been told. And by the time she pulled into the small driveway of the modest house she had lived in for over 30 years, she no longer felt confused. Not exactly, but alert, aware that something had been set in motion long before tonight, something that had unfolded without her knowledge. And as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click, she did not turn on the lights right away, choosing instead to stand in the quiet darkness for a moment, letting the stillness settle around her as a single thought formed clearly, firmly, and without hesitation. She had never received that house, and if she had not received it, then someone else had. Margaret did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to rest, moving carefully through memories the way one might walk through a familiar house in the dark, knowing where each step should land, checking each corner for something that no longer belonged. And as the hours passed, small details began to shift into place with a clarity that had not been there before. She sat at her kitchen table just before sunrise, a single lamp casting a soft circle of light across the worn wood surface, her hands wrapped loosely around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, and she began to think back to the past 2 years, not in broad strokes, but in precise moments, in conversations that had seemed ordinary at the time, In small changes she had dismissed because she trusted them, because she trusted him. Daniel had started calling less frequently. Always busy. Always traveling. Always promising to visit soon. And when he did visit, it was shorter. More structured. As if each minute had already been accounted for. And Victoria had taken over most of the communication, sending polite messages, carefully worded updates, reminders about appointments Margaret had never made, and offers of help that always seemed to arrive just after Margaret had already handled things herself. Margaret remembered one particular afternoon nearly 18 months ago when Daniel had mentioned something about paperwork, something about making sure everything was set up properly for her. And she had nodded without asking for details because she had believed that whatever he was doing was for her benefit, that it came from a place of care. And she had not wanted to appear ungrateful by questioning it. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of her kitchen, she replayed that conversation word for word. And for the first time, she noticed what had been missing. There had been no explanation, no document presented, no signature required. Just a vague reassurance followed by a quick change of subject, as if the topic itself had been something to move past rather than something to understand. She stood slowly and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, the one her husband had used for years, and she opened the top drawer, pulling out a neatly organized folder where she kept all of her important documents, her bills, her insurance papers, her bank statements, everything accounted for. Everything in its place, and she began to go through them one by one, her movements steady, deliberate, as she searched for any sign of a property transfer, any indication that something had been placed in her name without her knowledge. There was nothing. No did. No tax notice. No maintenance bill. No insurance policy. Not even a letter acknowledging ownership. Margaret paused, her fingers resting on the edge of the folder, and she let the silence fill the room again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, but revealing, as if the absence of those documents was speaking louder than anything she could have found. She moved to her laptop, the old one she rarely used except for emails and occasional video calls, and she opened it with a quiet click, waiting as it slowly came to life. And once it did, she began to search. Property records, county databases, anything that might confirm what Daniel had claimed, her eyes scanning each result with careful attention, and after several minutes, she found it, a listing, a lake house registered under a name she recognized immediately, not hers, but Victoria's. Margaret did not react outwardly. Her face remained calm, her posture unchanged. But something inside her settled into place with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And as she closed the laptop gently, her reflection faint in the darkened screen, she understood now that the surprise had never been meant for her. Not really. And that what had been presented as a gift was in fact a carefully constructed illusion, one that depended entirely on her silence, on her willingness to accept what she was told without looking any deeper. And Margaret Collins had spent a lifetime being patient, being kind, being trusting, but she had never been careless. And now that she had seen the truth for what it was, she knew she would not ignore it. Margaret did not rush to confront anyone, because rushing had never served her well, not in a lifetime of marriage, not in raising a child, and certainly not now, when the truth required something steadier than anger. Something quieter than confrontation. So instead she chose to sit with what she had discovered and let it unfold in her mind with careful precision, examining each piece until it no longer felt like suspicion but certainty. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of her kitchen, casting soft shadows across the floor, and she moved through her routine as she always did, making her bed, watering the small plants by the window, preparing a simple breakfast, each action deliberate, unchanged, as if the rhythm itself could anchor her while everything else shifted beneath the surface. But her thoughts did not drift. They stayed sharp, returning again and again to the same question, not whether something had been taken from her, but how long it had been happening without her noticing, How many decisions had been made in her name without her consent? She remembered the way Victoria had gradually positioned herself as the one who handled details, the one who knew the schedules, the accounts, the paperwork, always presented as helpful, always framed as support. And Margaret had accepted it because it made things easier, because it seemed reasonable that younger hands would take on those responsibilities, and because Daniel had trusted his wife, and Margaret had trusted him. But now, looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. The small exclusions, the subtle redirections, the way certain topics were always brushed aside with reassurance instead of explanation, and she could see how carefully it had been done, not all at once, but slowly, patiently, until it became normal for her to be informed rather than involved. Margaret sat down again at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and she allowed herself to think about Daniel, not as the successful man he had become, but as the boy she had raised, the one who used to ask her permission before making even the smallest decision, the one who once believed that honesty was the simplest path, and she wondered when that had changed, whether it had been a gradual shift or a moment she had simply missed. There was a part of her that wanted to believe he did not know, that he had been guided, influenced, perhaps even misled. But another part of her, the part that had listened carefully the night before, the part that had noticed the way he avoided specifics, the way he spoke with confidence about something that was not true, understood that whether he knew everything or not, he had participated in the lie. That realization did not make her angry, not in the way one might expect, but it settled into her with a quiet weight, something heavier than anger, something closer to clarity. And as she sat there in the stillness of her home, Margaret Collins made a decision that felt both simple and absolute. She would not accuse, she would not argue, and she would not reveal what she had discovered, not yet, because whatever had been built without her knowledge had taken time, and it would require the same patience to understand it fully. She rose from her chair with the same calm she had carried all morning, walked to the window, and looked out at the familiar street where nothing appeared out of place, where everything looked exactly as it had the day before. And yet she knew that something fundamental had shifted, not in the world around her, but in the way she would move through it from this point forward. Because she was no longer simply a mother being presented with a surprise, she was someone who had seen behind it, and once that kind of truth revealed itself, it could not be unseen. Margaret understood that knowing the truth was only the beginning, because truth without proof was fragile, easily dismissed, easily reshaped into something else, and she had no intention of allowing what she had uncovered to be reduced to a misunderstanding or explained away with polite excuses, so she began to move carefully, deliberately, building a quiet foundation beneath what she already suspected. That afternoon, she drove into town, not to confront anyone, but to gather information, the kind that could not be argued with, the kind that existed independently of anyone's version of events, and she started with the county clerk's office, a place she had not visited in years but remembered clearly, the same worn counters, the same rows of records, the same steady rhythm of quiet transactions. She approached the desk with a calm smile, asking for assistance with a property inquiry, her voice measured, her request simple, and within minutes, she was directed to a terminal where public records could be accessed, the screen glowing softly as she typed in the address she had found earlier that morning. The information appeared in neat, official lines, ownership details, transfer dates, filing confirmations, and Margaret read each one slowly, carefully, not rushing, not skipping, allowing the facts to settle fully in her mind. And there it was again, the confirmation she had already seen. The property legally registered under Victoria Collins, not transferred 2 years ago to Margaret, not even mentioned in her name at any point. Margaret printed the documents without hesitation, each page sliding out of the machine with a soft mechanical hum, and she gathered them neatly, aligning the edges before placing them into her folder. treating them with the same care she gave to every important record in her life. She did not leave immediately. Instead, she asked one more question about any filings related to her own name, any recent transfers, any property records she might not be aware of, and the clerk, polite but efficient, conducted a quick search before shaking her head, confirming what Margaret already knew. There was nothing. Outside, the afternoon air felt crisp, the sky clear in a way that made everything seem sharper, more defined, and Margaret paused for a moment beside her car, the folder held securely in her hands, her reflection faint in the window as she considered her next step. She drove home in silence again, but this time her thoughts were not searching. They were organizing, arranging what she had learned into something structured, something that could not be dismissed. And by the time she pulled into her driveway, she had already decided that this was not just about a house, not just about a document, but about a pattern, a deliberate shift in control that had been carried out gradually, quietly, and without her knowledge. Inside her home, she placed the folder on the desk, opening it once more to review the pages, her eyes moving over each line as if committing them to memory, and then she reached for another file, one that contained her bank records, her correspondence, everything that reflected her financial life over the past several years, and she began to compare, line by line, looking for anything that connected, anything that might reveal how far this situation extended beyond what she had already uncovered. The process was slow, methodical, but Margaret did not rush, because she understood that clarity required patience. And as the evening light began to fade, casting longer shadows across the room, she felt something steady settle within her. Not anger, not fear, but control, quiet, grounded certainty that she was no longer reacting to what had been done. She was preparing for what would come next. And for the first time since the night before, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, because now she was no longer in the dark. And more importantly, she was no longer unprepared. Margaret continued her review late into the evening, the quiet ticking of the wall clock marking each passing minute as she moved through years of records with steady focus, her eyes scanning numbers, dates, and names with a level of attention she had not needed before. And it was there, buried not in something obvious but in something subtle, that she began to notice another pattern. One that had gone unnoticed because it had been designed to appear ordinary. Small monthly deposits, consistent in amount, arriving on the same date each month, labeled in a way that suggested routine assistance, something easy to overlook, something easy to accept without question. And Margaret recognized them immediately as the support Daniel had occasionally mentioned, the help he insisted on providing after his father passed. Modest sums that she had appreciated but never depended on. Amounts that had never raised concern because they were small enough to feel personal rather than formal. But now, as she compared those deposits to the timeline of the property records she had printed earlier, a discrepancy began to emerge, not in what she received, but in what she did not. Because if Daniel had truly transferred a property into her name, if he had truly arranged something as significant as a lake house, then there should have been more. Maintenance fees, insurance payments, tax notices, something beyond these modest deposits, something that reflected ownership rather than assistance. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting on the open folder as she let the realization settle, and she considered the possibility that the money itself might not be what it seemed, that perhaps what Daniel believed he was sending, what he believed was reaching her, was not the same as what had actually arrived. She stood and walked to the cabinet where she kept her mail, retrieving a stack of old envelopes, each one neatly opened and preserved, and she began to match them to the entries in her bank statements, confirming dates, amounts, and sources. And with each comparison, the pattern became clearer, more precise, until it was no longer a question of whether something was wrong, but how it had been structured so carefully that it could continue without being noticed. Victoria's name appeared again, not directly, Not in a way that would raise immediate suspicion, but in small references, in account labels, in forwarding addresses, in details that connected quietly but consistently, forming a line that Margaret could now follow from beginning to end. She did not rush to a conclusion. She did not allow herself to assume more than what the facts supported, but the direction was unmistakable. And as she stood there in the soft glow of the kitchen light, holding a letter that now seemed far more significant than it had when it first arrived, she understood that this was not a single act, not a single decision, but a system, something that had been put in place and maintained over time, something that relied on her trust, on her willingness to accept what she was told without verification. Margaret returned to the table and placed the documents in order, aligning them with care, her movements calm, deliberate, and she allowed herself a moment to consider Daniel again, not just his words, but his certainty, the confidence with which he had spoken about something that did not exist in the way he described, and she realized that there were only two possibilities. Either he had been completely unaware of the truth, or he had chosen not to question it, and neither possibility changed what had happened, but it did shape what would happen next. The room remained quiet, unchanged, but Margaret no longer felt like she was sitting in the same place she had been the night before, because now she was no longer searching for answers, she was assembling them, and as she closed the final folder and rested her hand lightly on top of it, her expression remained composed, her posture steady, but her understanding had shifted into something firm and unyielding. She was no longer a participant in someone else's plan. She was now the one preparing her own. Margaret did not reach for the phone, did not send a message, and did not allow even a single word of what she had discovered to leave the quiet space of her home, because she understood that once spoken, the truth could be interrupted, redirected, or denied, and she had no intention of giving anyone the opportunity to prepare for what they did not yet know was coming. Instead, she chose to continue as she always had, moving through her days with the same steady rhythm, answering Daniel's occasional calls with calm warmth, responding to Victoria's messages with polite brevity, never revealing the shift that had already taken place beneath the surface. When Daniel called 2 days later, his voice casual, asking if she had thought more about the house, Margaret listened without interrupting, her tone even, her responses simple, and she allowed him to speak freely, to explain, to repeat the same details he had offered before, but this time she paid closer attention, not to what he said, but to how he said it, the pauses, the slight adjustments in his wording, the way certain questions were answered indirectly, and she noted each one carefully, storing them alongside the documents she had already gathered. Victoria sent a message later that afternoon, suggesting a weekend visit to the lake house, framing it as an opportunity for Margaret to finally see what had been given to her. And Margaret read the message twice before replying with a quiet acceptance, her words measured, agreeable, and entirely without suspicion on the surface, because she understood that agreeing was not surrender, it was strategy. The next few days passed without disruption, outwardly unchanged, but Margaret used that time to prepare in ways that could not be seen, organizing her documents into a single folder, making copies of everything she had found, placing one set in her desk and another in a small envelope she kept in her purse, ensuring that nothing could be misplaced, nothing could be taken from her without her knowledge. She also made one additional call, brief and direct, to a legal office she had worked with years before.
Requesting à consultation.
Not explaining everything, only stating that she needed clarity on property records and financial discrepancies, and she scheduled the appointment for the following week. After the planned visit to the lake house, when Saturday arrived, Margaret dressed with the same quiet care she always had, choosing neutral colors, simple lines, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything had changed. And as she drove to meet Daniel and Victoria, she kept her hand steady on the wheel, her expression calm, her thoughts clear, not racing, not uncertain, but focused. She was not going to the lake house as a guest. And she was not going as a mother expecting a gift. She was going as someone who already understood what she would find, someone who had already seen the truth on paper, and now intended to see how it was presented in person. When she arrived, Daniel greeted her with the same practiced warmth, opening the car door, offering a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and Victoria stood just behind him, composed as always, her posture perfect, her expression welcoming but controlled, and Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the view of the lake beyond them, the still water reflecting the afternoon light, the house itself standing quietly at the edge, and she allowed herself a small, polite smile as she looked at it, because from the outside, everything appeared exactly as it should, exactly as it had been described, and that was precisely what made it so carefully constructed, so complete. And as she walked toward the front door beside them, her pace unhurried, her gaze steady, Margaret Collins understood that this was no longer about discovering the truth. It was about watching how long they would continue to present it as something else. Margaret stepped inside the lake house with quiet composure, her eyes moving slowly across the space as if she were seeing it for the first time, though in truth she was not observing the decor or the layout, but the details that did not belong, the small inconsistencies that revealed more than the carefully prepared presentation ever could, and she allowed Daniel to speak as he guided her through the rooms, pointing out features, describing renovations, explaining how everything had been arranged for her comfort, his voice steady, confident, but just slightly too rehearsed, as if he had practiced each sentence until it sounded natural. Victoria followed a step behind, her presence controlled, her gaze attentive, watching Margaret closely, not in a warm or welcoming way, but in a measured, evaluative way, as if she were waiting for something, for a reaction, for a question, for a sign that the performance needed adjustment. Margaret paused in the living room, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, and she looked out at the lake through the large glass windows, the water still and reflective, the view exactly as Daniel had described, peaceful, desirable, complete. And for a brief moment she allowed the silence to settle between them before turning back with a gentle nod. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice calm, sincere enough to be believable, and Daniel smiled, relief passing quickly across his face as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. He moved closer, gesturing toward the hallway, mentioning additional features, offering details that sounded impressive but lacked substance, and Margaret listened, not interrupting, not challenging, simply allowing the narrative to continue unfolding exactly as they intended. Then, without changing her tone, without altering her expression, she asked a single question, simple, direct, and placed precisely where it would carry the most weight. "Which room is mine?" The question lingered in the air for just a fraction longer than expected, and in that pause, Margaret saw it, the shift, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's smile tightened. His eyes flicked briefly toward Victoria, and Victoria's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders lifting slightly before settling again. "Well," Daniel began, his voice steady but slower now, "we thought you could choose whichever room you like." Margaret nodded gently, as if the answer satisfied her, but she did not move. She did not step toward any of the rooms. Instead she let the silence stretch just enough to make the moment visible, just enough for the absence of clarity to become its own kind of answer. She walked slowly toward the hallway, opening one door, then another, each room furnished, prepared, but not personalized, nothing that suggested ownership, nothing that reflected her presence, and when she reached the final door, she paused again, turning slightly back toward them, her expression unchanged. "And the documents," she said softly, "where do you keep them here?" This time the hesitation was longer, more pronounced, and Margaret did not need to look directly at them to feel it, to understand it, because the truth did not reveal itself through words. It revealed itself through what was missing, through what could not be answered cleanly, and when Daniel finally responded, offering something vague about files being handled elsewhere, Margaret simply nodded again, accepting the explanation without resistance, without correction. She closed the door gently and stepped back into the living room, her movements unhurried, her demeanor composed, and she allowed a small, polite smile to return as she looked once more at the lake, as if nothing had shifted, as if everything remained exactly as it appeared. But beneath that calm surface, everything had already aligned, every detail, every hesitation, every incomplete answer forming a clear and undeniable picture. And Margaret Collins understood that she no longer needed to search for proof, because she had just witnessed the truth in its most unguarded form, not in documents, not in records, but in the fragile way their story began to falter the moment it was asked to hold itself together. Margaret did not raise her voice, did not confront them in the way they might have expected, because confrontation would have given them something to push against, something to deny, something to reshape. And she had already learned that the strongest position was not in arguing the truth, but in presenting it without emotion, without urgency, without giving it anything that could be dismissed as reaction. She remained by the window for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the still surface of the lake, and then she turned back toward Daniel and Victoria with the same composed expression she had carried since she arrived, her posture straight, her movements measured, and she reached into her purse with quiet precision. Daniel began to speak, perhaps to continue the tour, perhaps to fill the silence, but Margaret lifted her hand slightly, not to interrupt sharply, but just enough to pause him, just enough to take control of the moment without force. She placed a thin envelope on the table between them, the paper lying flat, unremarkable at first glance, and for a brief second neither of them moved, as if they sensed that something within it would not align with the version of events they had been maintaining. "I stopped by the county office yesterday," Margaret said, her voice calm, steady, without accusation, as if she were simply sharing a routine detail, and she slid the envelope slightly forward, inviting rather than demanding that they look. Daniel's hand hovered before picking it up, his fingers tightening just enough to reveal the shift beneath his composed exterior, and as he opened it, the quiet sound of paper unfolding seemed louder than it should have been, filling the space with a tension that had no need for raised voices. Victoria remained still, her expression controlled, but her eyes moved quickly, tracking each page as Daniel turned it, and Margaret watched them both without staring, observing the way certainty gave way to hesitation, the way confidence thinned when it was asked to meet something concrete. "The property is registered under Victoria's name," Margaret continued, her tone unchanged, not cold, not harsh, simply factual, and she let the words settle without adding anything further, because the document spoke more clearly than any explanation could. Daniel looked up then, his expression no longer rehearsed, no longer certain, and for a moment he seemed to search for something, an explanation, a way to bridge the gap between what he believed and what was in front of him, but the space between those two things had already been defined. Victoria finally stepped forward, her voice measured, offering something about administrative handling, about temporary arrangements, about details that had not yet been finalized. But Margaret did not interrupt. She allowed her to speak, to complete the explanation fully, because incomplete explanations were easy to dismiss, and she wanted everything said out loud, everything placed clearly in the open. When Victoria finished, Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them, and she reached back into her purse, placing a second set of papers on the table, bank records, timelines, small details aligned carefully, quietly, forming a pattern that did not require interpretation. "There is more," she said softly, and this time Daniel did not reach for the papers immediately, as if he already understood that whatever remained inside them would not support what he had believed. The room felt different now, not louder, not more dramatic, but more honest, stripped of the performance that had held it together. And Margaret allowed a brief silence to settle before she spoke again, her voice steady, her expression composed, unchanged from the moment she had arrived. "I have an appointment with a legal advisor next week," she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of direction, something that would happen regardless of their response. And she stepped back slightly from the table, giving them space, not because she was retreating, But because she no longer needed to stand at the center of something that had already been resolved, Daniel's shoulders lowered, the weight of what he was seeing settling into him, and Victoria's composure held, but only just, her posture more rigid now, her control more visible, and Margaret looked at them both with the same calm she had carried throughout, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, the kind that did not need to be explained. She turned then, moving toward the door with unhurried steps, and as she reached it, she paused only long enough to pick up her purse, her movements as precise as they had been all day, and without another word, without raising her voice or seeking acknowledgement, Margaret Collins stepped outside into the quiet afternoon, leaving behind a room where the truth no longer needed her to defend it, because it had already been seen.